In the spring of 1898, the United States stood on the edge of a war that almost nobody fully understood. Politicians promised it would be short. Newspapers promised it would be glorious. Military planners assumed Spain was weak. But wars have a way of exposing assumptions. And in just a few months, the conflict that became known as the Spanish-American War would reshape global power, destroy centuries-old empires, launch the United States onto the world stage, and reveal just how dangerous bad strategy can be. Because beneath the patriotic headlines and dramatic naval victories was a story of bold gambles, leadership under pressure, logistical chaos, and military decisions that could have gone catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how a declining empire fought to survive, how a rising power tested itself in war, and how a conflict lasting only 114 days changed the course of history. But to understand the war, we have to begin before the first shot was fired. Because by 1898, Spain was already fighting a battle it was slowly losing, a battle for Cuba. And that battle would drag the United States into a war neither side was truly prepared for. For centuries, Spain had ruled a vast global empire. At its height, Spanish territory stretched across continents. But by the late 19th century, most of that empire had disappeared. Latin American colonies had broken away. Economic problems were mounting. Military prestige had faded. What remained were a handful of overseas possessions. The most important of them was Cuba. And Cuba was becoming a nightmare. Cuban rebels had launched another major independence movement against Spanish rule. The conflict turned brutal. Spanish General Valeriano Weyler responded with a harsh counterinsurgency strategy. His goal was simple: separate civilians from rebel fighters, destroy support networks, starve the insurgency. In theory, it made military sense. In practice, it created humanitarian disaster. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were relocated into concentration zones. Disease spread rapidly. Food shortages exploded, death rates climbed, American newspapers seized on the horror, stories poured across front pages, illustrations showed suffering civilians, Spanish authorities were portrayed as monsters. Public outrage surged, but there was another layer beneath the headlines. The United States had enormous economic interests tied to Cuba. American businesses had invested heavily. Instability threatened trade, and increasingly many American leaders believed their country's future lay beyond its own shores. The question wasn't whether Cuba mattered. The question was whether America would intervene. Then everything changed. On February 15, 1898, the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana harbor. More than 260 American sailors died. Nobody knew exactly what caused the explosion. At the time, many Americans immediately blamed Spain. Newspapers exploded with outrage. "Remember the Maine!" The cry echoed across the nation. Politicians faced enormous pressure. President William McKinley remained cautious. He wanted evidence. He wanted diplomacy. He wanted to avoid war. But events were moving faster than caution. And soon, the pressure became impossible to resist. By April 1898, the United States declared war. Across America, crowds celebrated. Many expected a quick victory. Few understood the strategic reality, because although Spain was declining, it still possessed a global empire, and global wars require global strategy. What happened next would reveal just how unprepared both nations truly were. The strategic situation at the beginning of the war was remarkably simple. Spain's greatest strength was geography. America's greatest strength was industry. Spain controlled distant colonies. America controlled resources. The question became, who could exploit their advantage first? American planners quickly identified the center of gravity. Not Madrid, not Havana, the Spanish fleet. Destroy Spain's naval power and its empire becomes isolated. Protect the fleet and Spain might force a negotiated settlement. Everything revolved around ships, which made one man incredibly important: Admiral Pascual Cervera. Spain ordered him to take command of a squadron and cross the Atlantic. The mission was dangerous from the start. His ships were slower than many American vessels. Maintenance problems were severe. Coal supplies were limited. Crew readiness varied dramatically. Even worse, Cervera himself had serious doubts. He believed the mission bordered on suicidal. He warned superiors repeatedly. His fleet could be trapped, outnumbered, destroyed. But political leaders wanted action, and sometimes governments order operations because they need hope more than they need probability. So Cervera sailed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American leaders were preparing a strategy that would stretch far beyond Cuba. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt pushed aggressively for offensive action. He believed America should strike Spain wherever possible. One location immediately stood out: the Philippines, nearly 8,000 miles away. At first glance, it seemed unrelated to Cuba, but strategically it was brilliant. Spain's empire depended on communication and coordination across vast distances. Attack one colony and resources must shift. Attack multiple colonies and the entire system begins to fracture. Roosevelt saw this clearly, and one American commander was about to put that strategy into action: Commodore George Dewey. His orders were straightforward: destroy Spanish naval forces in the Philippines. What happened next would become one of the most decisive victories in naval history. Before dawn on May 1st, 1898, Dewey entered Manila Bay. The operation carried enormous risk. The bay was defended, mines were expected, coastal batteries stood ready. The American squadron advanced through darkness, silently, carefully. Every officer understood the stakes. A mistake could cripple the mission before the battle even began. But Spanish defenses proved weaker than expected, and as dawn approached, Dewey found his target, the Spanish fleet, anchored near Cavite, waiting. The moment had arrived. Dewey famously turned to his captain. "You may fire when ready." The battle that followed was astonishingly one-sided. American gunnery was superior. American ships were better maintained. American crews were better trained. Shell after shell slammed into Spanish vessels. The Spanish line began collapsing. Fires erupted. Ships drifted helplessly. Resistance weakened, then vanished. Within hours, the Spanish squadron was effectively destroyed. American losses were almost unbelievable, only a handful of casualties. Strategically, the implications were enormous. Spain had lost control of the Philippines, its Pacific fleet had ceased to exist, the empire had suffered a devastating shock. But victory created new problems. What exactly would America do with the Philippines? Nobody had a clear answer. Military success had outrun political planning. And history repeatedly shows that winning battles is often easier than deciding what comes afterward. Meanwhile, the war's decisive theatre remained elsewhere: Cuba. And there, events were accelerating toward a confrontation that would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. Because Admiral Cervera had arrived, and American forces were hunting him. Finding Cervera's fleet became the central operational challenge of the war. The Atlantic is enormous. A fleet can disappear. Rumors flooded newspapers. Sightings emerged constantly, some accurate, many false. American commanders scrambled to track Spanish movements. For weeks, uncertainty dominated planning. Then finally, Cervera entered Santiago de Cuba. The decision would define the rest of the war. Strategically, it remains controversial. On one hand, Santiago offered protection. Harbour defences existed, coastal fortifications provided support. On the other hand, the harbour entrance created a trap, a narrow bottleneck. If American forces blockaded the exit, escape would become nearly impossible. Cervera understood the danger, but fuel shortages and operational limitations left few alternatives. Soon, American naval forces arrived. The trap snapped shut. The blockade began. Now the problem shifted. The Spanish fleet was cornered, but not destroyed, and as long as it existed, it remained a threat. American leaders concluded the only permanent solution was capturing Santiago itself. That required an invasion. And that's where things became messy. Very messy, because America was about to discover that mobilizing an army is much harder than declaring war. The United States Army in 1898 was surprisingly small. Expanding rapidly created chaos. Equipment shortages appeared everywhere. Transportation plans broke down. Supply systems struggled. Units arrived without proper organization. Command structures became overloaded. Yet despite the confusion, an invasion force assembled in Florida. Among its officers was Theodore Roosevelt. By now he had resigned from government service. He wanted combat. He wanted action. He wanted to be part of history. And soon he would get exactly what he wanted. The invasion fleet sailed for Cuba. Thousands of soldiers packed aboard transports. Many lacked experience, many lacked training, but confidence remained high. The assumption was simple: land, advance, capture Santiago, victory. Reality would prove more complicated. American forces landed east of the city. Initial operations succeeded. Beachheads were secured, momentum built. Then came the next challenge: Spanish defensive positions and the most famous battle of the war. The terrain around Santiago favored defenders: dense vegetation, steep hills, limited visibility. Spanish commanders positioned troops carefully. One location stood out: San Juan Heights. Control the heights and you control approaches to the city. Lose them and Santiago becomes vulnerable. American commanders understood this. The heights had to be taken. On July the 1st, 1898, the attack began. What followed was confusion, courage, and chaos. American units advanced under intense fire. Coordination broke down repeatedly. Orders became unclear. Officers struggled to maintain control, yet the advance continued. Soldiers pushed forward through deadly rifle fire. Spanish Mauser rifles inflicted heavy casualties. Defenders fought effectively. For a time, the attack appeared stalled. Then momentum shifted. Individual initiative took over. Officers led from the front. Units surged uphill. Among them were Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Popular memory often places them at the center of the battle. The reality was more complex. Many units contributed. Regular army troops played critical roles, but Roosevelt's dramatic leadership became legendary. Eventually, American forces seized the heights. The victory proved decisive. Strategically, Santiago was now threatened directly. The city's defenses weakened dramatically, but the battle also exposed serious weaknesses: poor coordination, inadequate reconnaissance, communication failures. If Spanish forces had possessed larger numbers or stronger reserves, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, American momentum continued. And now Admiral Cervera faced an impossible decision: stay in harbor and wait, or attempt a breakout. Neither option looked promising. By early July, Spanish leaders understood the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Santiago was under pressure. The fleet remained trapped. Supplies dwindled. Morale suffered. Cervera knew his ships could not survive indefinitely. The blockade tightened every day. Remaining in harbor meant eventual destruction or surrender. Breaking out meant facing superior American naval forces. It was a classic strategic dilemma: choose the bad option, or choose the worse option. Orders eventually arrived. The fleet would attempt escape. The decision reflected more than military logic. Politics mattered. National honor mattered. Governments often accept battlefield risks they would never accept in peacetime. On the morning of July 3rd, 1898, Cervera made his move. One by one, Spanish ships exited Santiago harbor. American lookouts spotted them immediately. The battle began, and within hours Spain's hopes collapsed. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba was devastating. American ships possessed advantages in speed, firepower, and positioning. As Spanish vessels emerged, they came under immediate attack. Shells crashed into hulls. Fires spread. Damage accumulated rapidly. Cervera attempted to draw attention toward his flagship. His goal was to give other ships a chance to escape. It was a courageous decision. But courage could not overcome mathematics. American naval superiority was overwhelming. One Spanish ship after another ran aground, burned, exploded, or surrendered. By afternoon, the fleet was gone, destroyed. The consequences were enormous. Spain had effectively lost command of the sea. Without naval protection, overseas possessions became isolated. Reinforcement became impossible. Strategic options disappeared. The war's outcome was now largely decided. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the battle was how predictable it had been. Many Spanish officers had warned against the mission. Many recognized the risks. Yet political necessity overruled military judgment. It is one of history's recurring lessons. Leaders often understand the danger and still proceed because alternatives seem even worse. Now Santiago's fate was sealed, and with it, the fate of Spain's empire. After the destruction of Cervera's fleet, Spanish resistance began collapsing. Santiago surrendered. American forces tightened control. Operations continued in Puerto Rico. Spanish defenses there proved unable to reverse momentum. Meanwhile, the Philippines remained under American control. The strategic picture had transformed completely. Only months earlier, Spain had possessed a global empire. Now that empire was disintegrating. The speed of the collapse shocked observers. Yet beneath the victories, deeper questions emerged. Had America been lucky, or had it demonstrated genuine military superiority? The answer was complicated. American industrial capacity had clearly mattered. Naval modernization had mattered. Leadership had mattered. But luck played a role too. Spanish logistical weaknesses, political constraints, operational mistakes all contributed. History rarely belongs entirely to one side. Usually victory emerges from a combination of strengths and opponent weaknesses. And in 1898, America benefited from both. The shooting war was ending, but the consequences were only beginning, because peace would create new dilemmas. And some of them would prove even more difficult than war itself. The Treaty of Paris ended the conflict. Spain surrendered control of key territories. Cuba moved toward independence. Puerto Rico became American territory. Guam changed hands. The Philippines became an American possession. On paper, the war was over. In reality, a new chapter had begun. The United States had entered the ranks of global powers. The implications were enormous. A nation that had once focused largely on continental expansion now possessed overseas territories. New strategic commitments emerged, new military responsibilities appeared, new geopolitical rivalries loomed. For Spain, the defeat was traumatic. An empire centuries in the making had effectively collapsed. National identity entered a period of profound crisis. Military leaders studied what went wrong. Politicians searched for explanations. Citizens questioned assumptions. The shock would echo for decades. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the war is how many moments could have unfolded differently. What if the main had never exploded? What if diplomatic negotiations succeeded? What if Cervera remained elsewhere? What if American attacks at San Juan Heights failed? What if Spanish naval forces escaped Santiago? History often appears inevitable in hindsight. It never feels inevitable in the moment. In the moment, everything hangs on decisions, risk, chance, leadership, and the willingness of individuals to act under pressure. That is what makes the Spanish-American War so compelling. Not merely who won, but how. Because beneath every victory lay uncertainty. Behind every decision stood fear. And at every turning point, the future remained unwritten. The war lasted only 114 days, yet those 114 days transformed the world. An old empire fell, a new power rose, and the 20th century moved one step closer. A century that would be defined by global conflict, industrial warfare, and the struggle for international influence. In many ways, the Spanish-American War was the opening act. The moment America stepped onto the world stage and discovered that power brings opportunity, but also responsibility, and sometimes consequences nobody fully anticipates. The guns fell silent, the fleets stopped sailing, the headlines faded, but the strategic lessons remained: control the sea, protect logistics, match political goals to military reality, and never assume a short war will stay short. Lessons learned in Cuba, lessons written in Manila Bay, lessons paid for in Santiago, lessons that military leaders still study today, because while technology changes, human decision-making does not. And the story of the Spanish-American War remains at its core a story about choices. Choices made by presidents, admirals, generals, politicians, and ordinary soldiers. Choices that reshaped nations, choices that altered history, and choices that continue to echo more than a century later. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, subscribe for more videos on empires, wars, mysteries, and forgotten civilizations.